Here we go. So this is a story out of Minnesota on the minimum wage. So federal researchers looked into the Minneapolis and St. Paul $15 minimum wage boost. It boosted pay, but it cost jobs. Who could have predicted this? Oh, I don't know. Literally everybody. Literally everybody could have predicted this. But now we at least have a study on it, I guess. Okay, here we go. So many economists have reached similar conclusions about minimum wage increases in the past, but some progressives and labor groups argue $15 still isn't high enough to ensure working class families can make ends meet. Well, let's see how that worked out. Let's see how it worked out. The push to raise minimum wage to $15 an hour in both Minneapolis and St. Paul has successfully boosted the average worker's hourly pay in both cities. But it has also led to sharp drops in the number of available jobs and hours worked. New research from the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis has found many economists have reached similar conclusions. Still, the size of the impacts the researchers measured by comparing Minneapolis and St. Paul to data culled from other Minnesota cities from 2017 through 2021 were eye-popping, especially in low-wage industries. Why? They're the most obvious hit industries. When you take someone who was minimum wage was $7.25 an hour and you over double it to 15, what the fuck do you think is going to happen to the number of hours available? Businesses have finite money and they can't just raise price to compensate. If you double the price of their labor, you're going to lose labor. They can't afford it. It's insane. It's eye-popping. Why? Take Minneapolis's retail sector, for example. The minimum wage increase led to 28% fewer retail jobs than researchers would have expected from a similar city during the same 5-year period. By this comparison, Minneapolis also saw a 20% drop in hours worked and a 13% dip in aggregate workers' earnings. So raising the minimum wage, as expected and predicted, reduced the total amount of pay in the industries of the city. Yes, they cannot afford the labor. Across St. Paul's restaurant industry, the city's 2018 minimum wage hike was responsible for drying up nearly 1/3 of available jobs. The study found in limited service fast food restaurants, both hours and earnings fell by more than half after the increase took effect. Quote, these were larger effects than what even we expected. Though we had no idea before we went into the study what we would find, said co-author Anusha Nath, a senior research economist at the Fed. The research, which Nath conducted with 2 University of Minnesota economists, has yet to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. Across all industries, both cities saw hourly wages increase by an average of less than 1% and a roughly 2% drop in the number of jobs. The wage hikes accounted for the loss of an estimated 5,000 jobs in Minneapolis and another 3,800 jobs that dried up in St. Paul, Nath said in an interview. The papers could become new fodder for groups who oppose the Twin Cities push for the $15 minimum wage. That's just anyone with a fucking brain. Anyone with a brain should oppose minimum wage increases and should oppose minimum wage, period. That's right. The minimum wage set by government should be $0. If you want the fairest market assessment of the job's worth, it should be $0. And I love that people will argue with this despite the evidence forever. But you want inflation? Increase minimum wage. You want reduced productivity? Increase minimum wage. You want reduced jobs? Increase minimum wage. You want to force the most people at the lowest rung of the economic ladder, increase minimum wage. Because all you do is set the bar of poverty. And then you force everyone to model off that bar. And you give an excuse for a lot of jobs to underpay employees to the minimum. If a job is worth $9 an hour, but the minimum wage is $7.50, there's a high likelihood that the job will pay $7.50 for most of the people working there. Because unless you are savvy enough to negotiate for $9 an hour, they're going to pay you the minimum. That actually stays true up through several rungs of increases, maybe even to double the salary. Because the government told me this is the minimum I can pay, it is the minimum I will pay. And it's really easy to say negotiate. But at minimum wage jobs, you can make the argument that you're worth more than $7.50 an hour. But the reality is they probably have a bunch of people who are worth $7.50 an hour right behind you. And they're not going to ask for $9, $10, $11 an hour. They're just going to take the $7.50. And the amount of increased productivity that you bring at a low skill, low wage job is probably not worth the extra money. The reason I say zero is because the government should not be telling private industry what to do. People and businesses should come up with their own market rates, and they will largely do that. Will some people be left with lower paying jobs than what we would want? Sure. Sure. Yes, of course that will happen. It already does. It already happens this way. The zero is just 15 in these cities. It was 725 or 775. Now it's 15. Now you're forced to pay $15 for the person who was worth 7 because there was someone who was worth 12. And that's ridiculous. Every time the minimum wage is discussed and implemented in the way that they want with increases, it fails. Every time. And government should know this. They see this lesson every time they do it. And yet, as stated, government is inept. And raising the minimum wage never drug anyone at the minimum wage out of poverty. Ever. There is no one who went from poor because they were making minimum wage to not poor because they were making the new minimum wage. Do you know anyone who's like, oh, well, our minimum wage went from $8 to $12 an hour. Now I'm great. Now I'm great. Everything's fine now. Okay. I don't know anyone like that. I've never heard that story. I'm sure there's a politician who's gotten a letter from someone whose life vastly improved by going from $8 to $12 an hour with everybody else. Page CM says, one element missing to talk about. We have a greater amount of two earners needed, especially with small children or elderly working 2 part-times. So higher rate can reduce hours and still give a household a better quality of life. Maybe, but it also raises the price on everything. Have you seen what has happened to groceries and fast food? Guys, I went to Subway the other day and bought one sandwich. It It was $16 for a sandwich, 2 cookies, and a drink. $16 for a fucking Subway. I was like, what? The price has to come from somewhere. Increasing the amount of money in the system artificially increases the price of everything. When I go take my kids to like McDonald's or Culver's or something, and it's like $60, my God, you know what I could have made for $60? Jesus, we could have all been eating ribeyes tonight. Oh, and by the way, I get a basic bitch sandwich. I get a cold cut trio. It's not even an expensive sandwich. Beak boop. I would be a fat kid, but I didn't even eat the cookies. Gave them to my son. I like those cookies too, but someone ate his snack and didn't ask him, so. Snuggle Struggle says, my friend is an accountant. His resume is on some site that batches to companies in bulk. They lowball 20 to fill 3 jobs, hiring whoever accepts less. Yep. It's crazy, man. And it's consistent. It's consistent. Look, the concept seems sound. The idea that you can force people to get paid more and that people will be doing better seems like common sense because it only looks at one side of the issue. It only looks from the worker's perspective. Is entirely a socialistic sort of or Marxist perspective, the perspective of the laborer. But it doesn't consider the fact that the owner, that the private owner of a company or even the publicly traded and owned company, that they have an economic interest and investment in the company and that the company has finite resources. The company has to generate sufficient revenue to cover its labor cost, to cover growth, to cover its capital expenditures, and hopefully enough to be profitable. If the companies aren't profitable to a sufficient margin, then they stop existing because the work to run them isn't worth the money that's put in. And that may not be fair, right? But if you're an investor in a publicly traded company and that company is consistently doing 2% profits, so your massive investment of maybe $1 million is doing 2% annually, and you look at other industries, other companies, other possible investments, and you go, my money could be doing at minimum 6 to 12% annually. Following Standard & Poor's, it could be doing 15% annually on average. Why do you keep your money in a 2% business? Usually it's only passion at that point. Now, some businesses are so huge in scale that a small profit margin is actually acceptable. Oil companies, for example, are massive in scale and their profit margins typically aren't that big. Or at least they haven't been historically. A lot of times you're talking 5%, but the company is so huge that 5% number produces massive amounts of money that is beneficial for the people working there. That's the oil industry. Other companies like tech companies, Apple, stuff like that. Apple, I think, runs 20 to 30% margins some years. You start looking and going, where's my money more useful? Am I getting a 20% return? Am I getting a 2% return? That's a consideration that needs to factor into this. The fact that companies have to earn the money they're going to pay out. Now, of course, you can subsidize it. You can do all sorts of stuff. You can give them tax incentives, but that's all artificial. The reality is economics always exist, and they perform in relatively predictable ways. And if you just determine that the cost of labor in some industries has to almost double, well, you got to expect the number of available hours to go down. And so while individual workers may, and I repeat, may have a better short-term experience in those industries, you're cutting a lot of jobs right out of the market. You're cutting hours out of the market. You're cutting some of those part-time workers that were mentioned earlier out of the market because they don't have time to pay a part-timer. Or you're cutting full-timers into part-timers. You're reducing benefits. The government is bad at dictating how business should work. It's consistently bad at it. And yet they consistently do it. Paige CM with another super chat. Thank you, Paige. This is not saying government should be INV, but then it goes back to corporate greed because it's not going to the worker. You just proved that. We are paying minimum wage and costs still went up. It's a classic no-win situation. Well, I'm saying that there was a massive push for increases in minimum wage across the country that happened and that prices went up across the country. We also had some other monetary issues like just printing trillions of dollars. Inflation has to catch up at some point. And corporate greed sort of exists some places, but the risk is on those owners. All of the risk. Employees getting sued while working for companies, that goes to the company. Almost always. It's almost never on the employee. I mean, you talk about running a trucking company. Run a trucking company. Your trucker falls asleep at the wheel. Something happens, even if it's just icy, kills an entire family. $20 million judgment. Does a trucker bear that? Not unless he's doing something criminal, driving under the influence, negligently, like the guy in Colorado who checked his brakes. He knew they were bad, but he went down the hill anyway. Stuff like that. They bear the burden, but the company bears the cost of the lawsuit because the worker doesn't have $20 million, but that's a huge risk. And that's just one type of thing that can go wrong. All of this shit falls into different considerations. And that's what I'm saying. And that when we do minimum wage laws, where we just boost the minimum wage artificially, they're always shocked when businesses across the city shut down. They're always shocked when there's not as many jobs available. They're always shocked when workers don't have as much hours. The least surprising thing about this is that it's exactly what always happens. And they're always surprised by it. Because they only look at one consideration, and it is a valid consideration. The worker experience is critically important. We have entire fields of mental health professionals trying to figure out the worker experience because you got to have people working. You have to strike that balance. Is there enough pay? Are they mentally sound enough to keep going? Is it too stressful or is it just stressful enough? Where is the balance to keep people working, keep people living, and keep people relatively functional? But when you only look at the one side of the issue is, do they make enough money? Government says more money must be paid. It's never a correct solution. Tina Alpha says, I don't think you see the bigger picture. They want to raise the minimum so companies will fire all the staff so they hire Pablo instead for slave wages. And they don't need to worry about the minimum anymore. I mean, that could be some people's goals. Who knows what their goals are overall? My theory is pretty simple. I don't think it's that complicated. I don't think any of this is that complicated. Buy the votes with someone else's money. If you don't see where buying the votes with someone else's money is almost always the motivation of government policies that give money out, it's the simplest answer, and it's fucking correct pretty much every time. I want to buy your vote, but I don't have any money, but that guy has a shitload, so he's going to pay you twice as much because I said so. You want him to pay you more? Maybe keep me in office. Maybe next time we'll hike it up again. You got to buy those votes. And you can't do it directly. You can't go out and pay people to vote. But there are two major groups in this country who have found lots of ways to buy people by their vote. Policies that consistently hurt populations that think, oh, they're looking out for me. They aren't looking out for you. They never were.